board meeting. Because anything to do with the federal government account is quite complicated. This has to do with accounting, it has to do with appropriation, it has to do with input from citizens. So, what else do we need to know, Sarah? She represents 30 towns, but she's been doing this, she said, about what, half those towns have sort of gotten to this point where the residents are offering ideas and moving forward towards figuring out how to spend this money. We have just under $400,000 spent, and we want to spend it well. So that, please welcome Jeremy.
Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Thank you. So my name is Sarah Reed. I work with the senior planner with Riverside Regional Commission. I do a whole bunch of things in the office, just like everybody. It's sort of all hands on deck. And one of the things I do is I support towns in understanding what the federal rules are around using their ARPA dollars. And I'm here to support you with any sort of community dialogue that you want to have around this. So, this evening, what I'm hoping we can do is we can sort of start off with a brief introduction of, I'm going to share my screen for folks who are online. A brief introduction to how ARPA dollars work. And sort of where we're at and what the process looks like and what the rules are. And then we'll move into a discussion about, how do we actually, a lot of ideas are going to come to the table, a lot of ideas have already come to the table already. How do we come to agreement as a community on the criteria that we're going to use to evaluate those particular projects, right? So we'll have a discussion about that, we'll come up with some criteria, and then we'll actually dive into the project ideas themselves. We'll start off with the ones that have already been put on the table. Some of those are a little broad, so we may try to drill down a little bit and try to understand a little bit more of what those are talking about. And then we'll also just ask for new ideas from people. We'll put it into a big spreadsheet, which are now all pass back to the select board, and they can do the work that they need to do after this meeting, and then there will be another meeting after that at some point in time. So let's just dive in with a really quick bird's eye view of where we're at with ARPA, all the rules and regulations. Now, just happy to see questions at the end to be about 10 minutes or so, hopefully last. So many of you are probably already aware of the timeline of ARPA payments. So basically, ARPA money got paid to it as a town, village in Vermont in two sort of tranches, as it were. And the first 50% came in last summer, and the second 50% came this past August and early in September, early this month. So the town should have the full balance of the award in its account at this point in time. And the total allocation for, as I mentioned earlier, is just shy of $400,000. So that's a great chunk of change for the town to do some really good work with. Basically, the feds say that you can use these ARPA dollars to cover eligible costs, and we'll talk about that in a second, that have been incurred since March 3rd of 2021, which is when they consider the pandemic expenses under ARPA, which is very complicated thinking on their part to have started. And so anything that, your town has incurred since March 3rd, 2021 can work in that category. You have to obligate your funds by end of calendar year 2024. So basically that means you need to have some sort of written commitment or contract or select board resolution to spend the dollars on a particular item, particular project, right? And then all the funds have to be expended by end of calendar year 2026. Any dollars that you don't spend by the end of calendar year 2026 have to get returned to Treasury. So there's a timeline on all this stuff. Here's what Treasury says that you can spend your dollars on. And there's sort of four big categories, right? The first is lost revenue, which is basically there's a whole lot of federal sort of red tape around this, but basically the federal treasury said, okay, we're going to assume that every town, city, state in the country had at least $10 million worth of grant loss. That's true if you're a town of 150 people or a city of 10 million, right? So that they try to make that sort of easy access point. So small towns like us here in Vermont could say, okay, we're going to claim up to $10 million of our award as lost revenue. The reason for that is because that category is the most flexible of all the ARPA categories. So basically, and this is what the town has decided to do, and what every town in Vermont has decided to do. They said, okay, all right, we're going to tell the federal treasury that the entirety of our award is going to be used for the provision of government services. That's the most flexible category in ARPA. And that really is a huge category, because that can be, it doesn't mean that you're limited to the kinds of services that your government has provided up to this point in time. It can be any service provided by any city, state, county, local government, anywhere in the country, right? So it's a huge broad envelope to work with. And that's why we've been encouraging towns go for that categorization, because it's going to give you the maximum flexibility to use your dollars however you want to use them. For informational purposes, there are three other categories for how Treasury says there are dollars that responding to the pandemic, that includes direct assistance to households, businesses, nonprofits, impacted industries, premium pay for essential workers, and then water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure, which you may have heard about in the news, right? So basically, those categories really only come into play if you're, for example, a state that receives their full big pot of money, and it's a lot more than, you know, your standard allocation for lost revenue, more than $10 million, right? And so the remainder of your award needs to get used within these categories. But for the purposes of small towns in Vermont, you've got leeway to use your dollars to spend on any sort of provision of government services in your community. So some notes on revenue replacement. We've already talked about this as the easiest and most flexible approach. Any sort of traditionally provided by government, with a few exceptions, and we'll talk about that in a second. But that also includes administrative expenses. So your town staff time for actually making these projects happen can be charged under this particular ARPA category, right? Which is really great news. This particular category, anything that you might want to do that's eligible under those other categories are, like I mentioned, water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure, right? Because that's a separate category. You can do that under lost revenue, and that's considered a government service, right? So again, it's sort of an administrative trick to make sure you have the maximum flexibility in your dollars. One of the things that we've been talking about with the select board for a few meetings now has been an approach that we are sharing with towns across Vermont, because as you all know, the contracting world is really tough right now. And for those towns that are considering doing big projects, it's getting harder and harder to imagine being able to meet that timeline of getting all of your funds obligated by end of calendar year 2024 and then spent by end of calendar year 2026. The contractors for really big projects, water, sewer, et cetera, are just looking up. So one strategy that, and this is a strategy that's been blessed by the Vermont legal cities and towns, by all of their legal staff and their town staff, is to say, okay, we're going to sort of do a switch out of funds. We're going to use our ARPA dollars to pay off non-contract portions of our operating budget. Basically, that means town staff salaries and benefits. And the reason why you do that is because basically, when you do that, you free up a whole pot of money that you had originally budgeted out of other funds, and that becomes surplus. And effectively, what you've done there is you transform federal dollars that have all this red tape and restrictions attached to it into local dollars that have no time, that have no timelines attached, that have no federal regulations attached. The only sort of rules that you have to abide by, if you go ahead and take that strategy, are that you have to follow your local town's policies and procedures for how to spend surplus funds. That's it. So basically, this is a strategy that we've been sharing with towns around the region. Other RPCs are doing it for towns all across the state. It's a way, again, to really maximize the flexibility of the use of your funds and make sure that you don't get caught in a timeline crunch at the end of this current period. So I know that this is a strategy that the select board is considering as a way of really sort of making sure that you can use these dollars however you want on your own timeline, on your own. So just wanted to share that sort of background information. Now, if you were to go ahead and do that and switch out $1,000 and convert them to local dollars by creating a surplus, as I mentioned, you don't have to worry about any sort of treasury restrictions, but you can't spend some money on that sort of thing. If you choose not to take that route, if you say, no, okay, we're just gonna spend our dollars directly on the project that we want to work on, then there are some categories that you're not allowed to spend those dollars. The first of those is you can't make extraordinary contributions to pension payments. Basically, like if you want to pay town staff, you make your regular contributions to your pension with every paycheck, that's totally fine. But if you've got some accrued debt or liability on your pension fund, and you want to pay down a whole big chunk of that at once, that's not allowed. You're not allowed to sort of squirrel that money away into a rainy day fund or a reserve fund. You're not allowed to service debt, and this is a weird one, but you're not allowed to like, you know, or incur any fees to actually start a debt service or actually complete paying off debt, regardless of when that debt was incurred. So if you're thinking about a big project, that means you basically got to do a big down payment on that project using your ARPA dollars, right? So, and there's, you know, strange federal reasoning around that, but that's the way it is. Our Treasury also says you shouldn't be using ARPA dollars to do any projects that would sort of contravene CDC guidance around COVID. So their example is don't go building an elder care facility where you're going to be bringing a lot of people in close quarters together. We don't want you doing that with your ARPA. They also say you shouldn't be using it to pay off any sort of fees or penalties that you've incurred as a result of some sort of court or administrative regulatory judgment or settlement. There are some exceptions to that. We had one town that was in that sort of bind, and they're like, we really need to use ARPA dollars on this, and we figure out a way to do it, and we found a way to do it. So if you're in that position, talk to them, we can figure out what you want to. And then finally, you got to comply with all other federal, state, and local laws. So that's the sort of nitty gritty of what Treasury said around what you can and can't do with the money. Again, if the town doesn't hesitate that strategy of sort of freeing up money in the operating budget, creating a surplus, then all those categories of what you can and can't do are sort of out the window, right? They no longer apply. So I wanted to pause and take a minute and see if anyone had any questions about what the ARPA regulations have to say.
The strategy where you pay all the other town expenses and have a surplus.
Right.
I thought towns couldn't hold on to that, like at the end of the year, if you've got surplus money, I think you would refund that to the taxpayers unless you have a special article. So how do we circumvent that, or is it dependent on each year you just carry the surplus and count on the fact that the town is gonna vote to pay it forward until it's, you know, dissipated?
It's really going to depend on your own town policies. I'm not sure what your local policies are around how to deal with surplus. Towns have been around the state, have been working on this. There is somebody up at the OCC who is a government finance expert who's actually giving one-on-one technical support to towns to figure out how to make this work within their policies and within their specific budgeting system. Because there's no one-size-fits-all solution there for how to make it work, but it is legal. The question is, how do you make it work within your town? And maybe that means that you create, maybe you have some sort of vote at town meeting day to create a special fund that the circle funds get transferred into. I don't know. It's really a question of what makes sense based on your laws that are on your books, and then making life easier for.
I thought it was state law that said towns can't like just have a surplus and squirrel it away. And
No, you have, we as a town, I think our policy is that we have to vote. So any surplus in the general fund must be voted on in town meeting to what we do with it.
but that's not state law, that's just, I thought school districts, we can't. We can't,
We have to ask for.
yeah, that's state law, but I don't know, maybe it's local convention.
So the folks up at VLCT were looking into this because I think there's been a lot of sort of differing opinions on what state law requires you to do with surpluses. A lot of people were under the impression, oh, you have to have a vote at town meeting day. That's state law. That's not actually state law. So really, it just comes down to your local policies and procedures. That's the guidance that we've gotten from VLCT so far. But again, it's super important that town finance folks talk with people up at VLCT and get that one-to-one support. That's what they're there for. They're there to help you through it.
But in terms of actually running up against the deadline for actually spending, not committing, but actually spending the money. Really, the town could take until 2026 and make best efforts to try to complete projects, and in 2025 recognize that they weren't able to do it, to spend all the money, at which point they could then take the surplus and use it to to pay administrative expenses. And so really, we have 4 years to make best efforts to try to spend the money, and then at the end, find out that we're not able to completely spend the totality of the amount, and then spend it on administrative fees.
Right, if the numbers work out, right, like if you've got enough in administrative expenses at the end, that you can cover the balance. I've been told recently, because this came up for another town, that, they said, well, we don't really have enough in expenses to carry us to reach the total of our award, right? So we want to do this switch up, and we want to convert it to local dollars, that for the next, 3-4 years, we don't have enough in administrative expenses to equal that amount. And so it is possible to go back to that March 3rd, 2021, retroactively pay for stuff that you've already paid for. The accounting for that's more complicated, a little bit more nuanced, but I'm told it can be done. So again, it's tough to feel see about that. Other questions? Okay, cool. Circle back.
Yeah, so if you just say, we're just gonna cover like the annual town budget starting in March 3rd of 2021. Basically, is that like tax relief? You could just say, we're just gonna, like, instead of taxing ourselves, we're just gonna use that 400,000 to cover the town's expenses until it's gone.
So that is a permissible use of this money under ARPA, is that you can provide tax relief to citizens. That's something that's not allowed if you're a state or a territory, but it's silent on the part of local government. So that is something you can do. Yeah. One of the things I don't think I mentioned is that the reason why the LPP has been encouraging towns to specifically pay off salaries and benefits of within your operating budget is that those are non-contract portions of your budget, which means you get to sidestep federal procurement regulations. If anybody's familiar with, I'm sure in the contracting world, federal procurement regulations are lengthy and exhausting and enough to give anybody a headache. And so if you have any opportunity to sidestep those, I highly recommend that you do. It will make your life administratively much easier. So again, that's why the emphasis is on salaries and benefits.
Simple question. So you had said that 2024 is when you have to have a plan. But then in 2025 or 2026, if you find that you can't spend all the money based on that plan, you can adjust that plan up until 2026?
So you would need to have all of your money obligated by end of calendar year 2024. So what that would mean is, and this is assuming that you have not converted it to local dollars, right? So that would mean that at December 31st of 2024, you need to have written contracts in place, select board resolutions in place, accounting for every last dollar that you want to spend. I assume that any dollar that is not obligated by that point, you're going to have to consider a loss, right? Because you haven't actually accounted for it. But presumably, once you get to the end of December 2024, you could look at where you're at, say, we're not going to be able to obligate, the rest of this money in time because the contractors are busy or whatever, or we can't get the state permitting for the project we want to do, that sort of thing. So at that point in time, you can say, okay, we're going to go ahead and take the rest of this award and say we're going to take salary benefits for the period of A to B, right? And that's how you can sort of make sure you've obligated it.
So that would be after the 2024 that you make that change.
You would need to obligate it before the end of 2024. So presumably it would be like the last minute decision in December. You'd say, are we good? Do we have everything taken care of? If not, okay, then let's go ahead and allocate as much for salary. That helps.
Is there an example like that? How much leeway would the federal government give you, if, say, just for an example, when you say we want to buy a dump truck, $200,000, but we get to that point where we're like, no, we just need a one-ton truck. Does it, is that permissible for, to wiggle and maybe get something different or something similar, like instead of building a wing on the back garage, we put a roof on, you know, those sort of things, or is it very, very specific to your obligation?
That's an excellent question. And I don't know that any small community has actually gotten to that point yet, right? Because we haven't passed the deadline for obligated, so we still have this flexibility. I have not seen any guidance or regulatory language specifically around that. I would assume that if you had obligated for more than the real time, you would be fine. But I don't know. And I don't think that Treasury is necessarily going to check on the bill. When you said you were going to add vendor abatement, I don't necessarily think that be a problem. I think the matter of hand is, have you actually committed all the dollars for the work? Sorry, I wish I could give you that answer now, but I haven't seen any like really detailed about that.
Right. Well, probably as we go along, right? Right. Like, solar panels on this, but then we decide to put them on the down garage. Like all those sort of things happen in real life, but, right? Well, no one for you.
Which again, because, you know, the whole rollout of ARPA has been, anybody who's involved in knows that there's been fits and starts and, you know, misdirection from Treasury, and then they've changed their minds, and then the guidance is out. So again, based on like the headaches that everybody's already gone through, it just makes that much more sense to create a pool of local dollars. You don't have any federal restrictions on it, so you just don't have to deal with that. Great. Any other questions? Okay. All right. So at this point, as mentioned earlier, let's dive into thinking about, you know, once we've got all this list of projects that's on the table that folks think are worthy to spend community ARPA dollars on, how do we go about actually just deciding between, right? Looking at a whole bunch of things in a row and saying, okay, well, this is better than that one's worse than that. And really, you know, in order to make sure that it's not just the person who's shouting the loudest at a community meeting who gets their way, the way that you really do that is you come up with criteria that everybody can agree on by which to measure the projects against, right? And so what the hope is for this meeting is that we can at least come up with a list of some basic criteria, and what we'll probably have to refine it a little bit, figure out how to define something and how they want to actually score it. But the idea then is that you've got this list of criteria, you can say, okay, well, project A, how well does it meet this criterion? You can either use it be a yes or a no, or you know, on a scale of 1 to 5, how well does it actually meet the criterion? And then you can come up with some way of ranking them and comparing these projects. So I wanted to give you some examples of evaluation criteria that have been developed by other towns that I've worked with. I want to come back to real estate. Sorry, this is so small, so I'm going to read it out to you. One criterion here is, you know, are there alternative funding options available to achieve this project, to get this project done? There's a lot of grant money circulating out there in the world. Is there a different way that we can find this out instead of using ARPA funds or can you contract your funds? Can you contract with funds by the end of 2024 and complete it by end of 2026? So in other words, can you meet that on the timeline? Does this particular type of project or proposal have a track record of success in other communities? Is it benefiting disproportionately impacting community members? Is it increasing resilience by, you know, benefiting the overall health and well-being of community members? Is it meeting residents' basic needs, housing, shelter, food, that sort of stuff, heat? Is it necessary or helpful to the town staff during a shutdown or pandemic situation? And this criterion actually came from Heartland, where they were thinking about, you know, how do we make life easier on the town staff if we end up in another lockdown situation? How do we support them? What kind of equipment do we need? What kind of programs do we need to make things run more smoothly for them? Another criterion here is, you know, does this project create unsustainable burdens for the town, either money-wise, financial, or staff capacity moving forward? So, you know, if you're going to create a water system, obviously there's going to be operations and maintenance costs for that water system running in the future. So can you sustain that as a town? Your ratepayers sustain that. Or, if you're gonna create some sort of social services program, who's gonna run that? Who's gonna be, who's gonna pay their salaries? Is it any town staff who are gonna be doing work? Do they have time to do that work? Do they have enough? Have to be, and they have to be on that work. Same with grant, sort of like contracting as well, like there's always work if you're gonna do some sort of big construction project, somebody has to manage that contract, right? So our town staff in a position where they're able to take on that extra work. Compatibility with present town projects and priorities, again, this is another Portland criterion, and really the idea there was, is there synergy with stuff that the town already has going on, stuff that the town's already committed to doing? Is the idea is there that there might be some cost benefits associated with that, and it might just be easier too for town staff to manage two projects that are similar and kind of fit together and sort of run along the same track, as opposed to taking care of two projects that are wildly different, and have very different contracts and very different set of goals for operating by. Another criterion, how many people is this project going to impact? What's the bang for the buck at the end of the day? Your return on investment. Is the project manageable for town staff? Can you decide of it? How long lasting are the impacts going to be on the town? What percentage of your award is this project going to eat up at the end of the day? Are you spending 50% of your award on one project? Do you feel good about that? We've already talked about future administrative financial burden, except for repeat, sorry about that. Can you use these dollars to leverage additional state or federal grant funding, right? So one of the great things about ARPA is that it's given towns a pool of money that they can then use as match for even larger grants that they might be able to pull in. And that match is always something that towns stress about. It's hard to meet. So it's something that we do encourage you to think about. There's a big project that you can get some state funding for. ARPA is a great source of match to get that over the knowledge. How urgent is the need that you're facing for this particular project? Are folks available to do the work? Contractors to do the work? Now, what kind of timeline, right? Another sort of couple of criteria that we also suggested is, is this project that you're considering something that you've already talked about in existing town plan, right? Has the community already had this discussion? They already decided that they want to go down this road. And then another criterion that we also suggested is, if you go ahead and do this project, are you going to be setting a precedent that's going to be kept to meet in the future? Are you going to be setting an expectation that the town's going to, for example, continue paying for community health nursing services in the future? So those are some example criteria. I'm going to go ahead and switch over here to a blank sheet of paper so we can start thinking about, for the folks online, I'm going to go ahead and share the screen. So at this point, I just wanted to open the floor to everybody and ask what your thoughts are around how do we evaluate projects? What do you want to make sure that a project achieves and accomplishes? What makes a good project?
So for me, because I claim taxes, that idea of the future cost is very important. Because it's going to cost us a lot well into the future, or is this that ARPA is just going to cover it? That's important to me.
I was gonna, I like something that would have a long lasting impact. I think that's really important. If you win the lottery, you don't just buy houses and cars and folks, you want to invest. And I think that's a way to frame this ceremony.
I think looking at the ability to support projects through other funding opportunities.
I like the thought, I helped work on the town plan, that comports with the town plan language, it's in the town plan, and also looks to the future as to building out from what that project would be as it gets extended throughout the town. Not just a one-off that's just happening in 1 or 2 years, but there's an evolution that's coming out.
Would you say that evolution is similar to what we were talking about earlier about long lasting impact?
Correct, yeah, so I'm particularly interested in renewable energy, and the town is a little bit behind the curve on it. And we know that that's a big pile.
Thank you. Other thoughts?
I think it sort of relates to long lasting impacts. You know, there's a lot of things in town already that we look at and say, 100 years ago, somebody was thinking about us. So I would love it if 3 generations from now, people say, good job, 22 people, you know, for your, you know, to your point of like, we can do a one-time thing that's ephemeral, or we can do something that like has a life, you know, lifetime or several lifetime payoff. And that being a measure of quality of the project.
I'm just gonna put a little more active here. It sounds like this is really sort of floating the commons being shared for multiple people.
Could you talk a bit maybe about the ARPA dollars that the state got?
Yeah.
And if any of those are potential match type situations? And then maybe also with the match money, how other towns, you know, what's something that they've targeted? Like, I mean, we see matches or percentages say a lot with, if we build a bridge in Tunbridge, right? V-Trans says we'll pay 80, you pay 20. So those sort of situations, if you have an example or two from another town, that'd be great.
Yeah. So, question of state ARPA. So just like every town and village in Vermont got a little pot of money, state got a big pot of money. And the state is still trying to figure out how to use that pot of money. They came up with a budget proposal. And then there was like a little bit of confusion around, oh, we don't know if we can actually, you know, do that according to the regulations. And so they're still sort of figuring some of that stuff out. A lot of that money went toward, community water and wastewater systems. And supporting especially those kind of systems in small communities. As I understand it, the prioritization process for that was sort of set in place before ARPA dollars even hit the ground. So they really already identified a list of communities that were the top priority. It sounds like they're getting to the tax to those funds. A lot of money went to broadband, fair bit of money went to housing as well. In terms of, I should note too, so there was quite a bit of media coverage of one particular use of ARPA funds that the legislature wanted to achieve, which was sort of laid out in Bill H518, which said, okay, we're going to make a whole bunch of ARPA money available to towns that want to make renovations to their municipal facilities to make them more energy efficient, or to maybe transition them to a more renewable source of energy. Unfortunately, as of today, I spoke with our executive director and listening in on those conversations in those meetings. That one has stalled, and we're not certain that the legislative intent for that money is actually going to be achieved. So that's a real, you know, it's frustrating in part because a lot of the towns that we serve are in a position where they want to do that kind of work. They were really hoping to get that additional state money so they didn't have to spend their local ARPA dollars on that. But the best we can say right now is, you know, wait and see, but we have no idea what the timeline is on that. So anyway, that's an important update that folks should know about. Using your local dollars as match. One important caveat is, you know, if you're going to go down that road, always check with your funder, just double check and say, hey, is it okay if we use our local ARPA dollars as match? It should be fine, but just double check. There's a few minor sort of exceptions in Treasury's rule that might give you a bit of a hang up, but for the most part, we've seen all of our towns be able to work through that and they've been able to use their dollars as match. So, match projects. We have, I would say that right now, we've got towns that are doing water, wastewater projects. They're getting a heavy lift from the state on those, and they're using some of their local water dollars. I think that's what we've mostly seen match used for. There's been some, discussions that I've seen come over email around using, ARPA dollars as match for V-Trans grants as well, for various grants, whether it's a bike connectivity study or something to that effect. And we worked through any sort of complications with V-Trans around that, and they said, yes, we use that money as match. But I don't have a specific project in mind, I can immediately call to mind, but I know that they're in the works and they're working through that. So there's been a lot of conversation, and the best advice I can give you is, if you wanna go ahead and do that road, just be in close conversation with your funder about exactly how that's gonna go forward. V-Trans said, yeah, we'll definitely let you use this match for all these different programs, but you've gotta fill out a bunch of paperwork and, make sure that your invoices include this disclaimer and all those stuff. Other thoughts about criteria? How do we judge what's a good project? What's worthy of getting funded with this particular pot of money?
Benefits a large number of people in the town.
Thank you.
I don't know if this is even an issue, but, that recognizes climate change. I know a lot of people lost water this summer because we had such a drought. So I would love to see something in place that would help people, that their livelihood or their ability to live here is impacted because of climate change.
Other thoughts?
Just add the word, or building resiliency to future impacts of climate change and all the many permutations of natural disasters, new diseases, tropic, we're gonna have dengue fever in Vermont.
Okay.
May I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Just to Jenna's point, which I would echo about leveraging matching funds and supporting other projects, is in terms of actually identifying those matching funding opportunities, are you somebody who helps us with this, or is it an appropriate use of ARPA funds to actually hire somebody as a consultant who can help identify opportunities for us to leverage other grant opportunities or it may not be the case, but it seems to me we have a small local government who may not have the ability to do that because they have other things on their hands, and doing that might be helpful in terms of figuring out how to maximize the value.
Yes to both. So I'm certainly a resource. VLCT has an incredible website where they've done their best to pull together all the information they can find about all the grant programs that are running right now that you might be interested in accessing. So if you go onto their website, go under ARPA, I think there's a separate tab that's funding opportunities, and there's a database that's been compiled up in Chittenden County, which is statewide, not just restricted to Chittenden County. And then there's also sort of separate compendiums of grant opportunities for various state agencies. So highly recommend those resources. I'm also happy to be a liaison, and yes, you can absolutely hire a consultant to help you manage your efforts. That's spelled out specifically by Treasury as eligible. So I do want to get on to talking about specific projects. Can I ask for sort of a raising of hands in the room, to let me know which of these, let's say that it's important for the select board to understand which of these criteria feel more important than the others. Not to say that one of them is unimportant, but it's good to know if some of these criteria should have more emphasis than others. I'm so sorry.
So something else that I'm thinking about is, and thinking how to frame it. We all have the privilege of having the time to be here on a Wednesday evening. This list, I don't know that it necessarily reflects the point of view of members of our community with less privilege. And something that I think about with the economy being the way that it is, yeah, I'll say that it is thinking about using these funds in a way so we provide more equality to our community, because we're a pretty diverse community. And I don't necessarily see that diversity reflected here within this room.
How does improve equitable outcomes for the community? How does that?
I just something that's,
Thank you. That's really important. Okay.
Sarah.
Yes, please.
And maybe it's not a criteria, it's more of an approach of how we look at ARPA, but thinking of how we do community engagement. So like making sure that there's the people who aren't able to be here at 7 o'clock on a Wednesday are able to weigh in on the importance of this money and how it's spent and what that looks like, whether it's a support committee or how that gets worked out, but definitely.
So of these criteria that we have listed right now, you know, the future financial impacts of the project, how long lasting these impacts are, the ability to leverage match and support other projects, whether it fits into the town plan for the benefit of a large number of people in town, is it, you know, responding to climate change and improving disaster resiliency, is it improving equitable outcomes for the community? Can I show of hands, kind of read through this list for the number of people who feel like that is a really one of the top 3 criteria that you would want to be considered. So if you can take a look at that list, think about what would be your top 3 that you would like to give the most emphasis to. It's not to say that the other ones are going away. This is just to give the select board a sense of, you know, maybe some criteria should be weighted more than others. Okay.
Should we limit our raises to 3?
Yes, it's easier. Please, we raise your hand this time for the one that you feel are important. Okay.
menu enlargements can be read.
Yes, that's all of
Can I add one more to the list?
Yes.
Wants versus needs.
Okay, can you tell us a little bit more?
I think we need to weigh what we want and what we need.
So the urgency of what's actually needed needs to come into the equation. Does that sound right?
Well,
Like whether something's actually needed versus
I mean,
not
we need-
important.
I feel like we need water supply down the fairground for the fire department. What don't we need? I don't know. I just heard about a sidewalk project up Stratford. We just rolled out $6,000 for a feasibility study. But obviously, not very feasible. So I like stuff that.
I don't believe that we have sold out money for that feasibility study yet. We did a grant to do a sidewalk feasibility study. And the grant's been approved, but it hasn't, I haven't heard, I don't know if the select board's heard any more about that. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we would go up the Stratford Road. It was more talking about, so I think that's kind of gotten a little blown out of proportion because people don't have all the information, nor, you know, I don't know that anybody here has all the information about that grant is going to be like. So I think.
So you think it's feasible?
I don't think that it's feasible right now, but all I'm saying is that, you know, when you start saying that this is gonna happen, all I'm saying is it's not necessarily gonna happen. It's just an idea.
And all I'm saying is we need to weigh.
Right, exactly, and I think that you're perfectly right in saying wants versus needs. I mean, yeah, it would be a great idea if we could reduce Stratford Road and get a bike path out to the recreation field. But it might be a much better thing to have, you know, all the town records in the cloud in case there's an emergency. Or, you know, some of the other things that are like maybe water for the fire department would be great too. So I just, but I was involved with that grant. I just wanted to clarify that it's not. You know, really stone. Thank you.
Thank you, that was really helpful. Right, is there anybody online and working on? There's not. So I'm just gonna go ahead and read out the three, you just raise your hand to the three that you feel like, let's give those a little bit more weight than others.
I'm sorry, I asked for clarification.
Please.
Are these funds allowed to be mixed with into existing contracts or budgeted items?
They are, so long as, so if you're trying to mix it with like an existing grant that you're getting from some other agency or whatever, double check with them and make sure it's okay. If you're trying to mix it with your existing operating budget, that's absolutely fine. There's no sort of regulatory constraints that have to worry on that. Is that okay?
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so future financial impact of a project. What was the question? Future financial impacts of the project. Do you feel like that should be one of the more important criteria in weighing the value of the project?
So you're saying one of your top three.
One of your top three, raise your hand. So the first one we're asking about is future financial impact of the project. Next one down is the long lasting impact of the project. Does the project have long lasting impact? Okay.
Sarah, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, I want to clarify what I meant about like the leveraging that and support.
Yep.
Do we have the ability to pay for this project with another way? Do we want to use ARPA to pay for those projects, or do we want to use ARPA for things that we can't fund? But I don't think that actually helps.
Would you envision that as a separate criteria?
I don't think so. The ability to use that money to either match or plug holes that exist that where there aren't other grant funding sources.
Thank you, that makes a lot of sense. That makes sense. So let's raise our hands for that project. If you feel like that's one of your top criteria, the ability to, you know, use your ARPA dollars to leverage and match for another project or to fill holes in existing budgets for other projects that are already ongoing.
That don't have other funding sources.
That don't, right, that don't have other funding. Got four there. Okay. Next criteria down is, does it comport with the town plan? Is it something that's already been identified as a community need in the town plan?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. All right. Does this project benefit a large number of people in the town? Does this project recognize, respond to climate change threats and improve the town's disaster resiliency? Does this project improve equitable outcomes, socially equitable outcomes for the community? And then the last one is this project something we want versus is this project something that we really need? The urgency of the need of that project. Good. Thank you all very much. It's super helpful to will pass that information on to people like her. Let's go ahead now and dive into the actual project list. I'm gonna go ahead and share this as well. Okay, so basically, what I've done here is I've just started to make it so that select board will be able to do it once they got to start evaluating the project. So what I've done is I've entered the projects that have already been posted on the town's website. So the ARPA page is on the town's website, and it looks like folks have been suggesting ideas, and those ideas have been posted as they've been put forward. And some of those projects have dollar amounts attached to them, some of them don't. What I wanted to do quickly this evening is to run through, just to refresh everybody's mind in case you haven't looked at the list, so you know what's already been proposed. Some of these projects are a little broad, and I'm hoping that maybe there's somebody here this evening who can speak to that and have some more ideas for how we can narrow these down and make them more specific and make them more concrete, so it's easier for select boards to evaluate them. And then we'll ask for any new ideas, something that's not on the list that you want to make sure gets added into the mix. So I'm just going to run down the list here, and I'm going to leave the piece of paper easier than the computer. So on the list so far, we've got hiring a grants manager, somebody to apply for and administer grants. Paving Recreation Road to the town garage, and it sounds like the benefit of that project is gonna bring down the levels of silica in the garage, which is good for both the health of the people there and also the computers. And that's about $140,000. Buying radios for the town trucks for ongoing and emergency communications between town office, emergency personnel, about $22,000. South Royalton Ambulance Building Project, South Royalton Ambulance serves half of the town. That project is estimated at about $25,000. First Branch Ambulance Dispatch, and First Branch serves the other half. No cost estimate on that right now. Digitizing the town records, to support remote access, secondary security, and that's a $19,000 cost estimate. Updating the computer system server. Cost estimate there is anywhere between 15 grand and 17,500. Energy efficiency upgrade to the town office. And it sounds like the specific projects that have been prioritized are work in the basement, which would be between 22 and 25 grand. First floor walls, which would be between 52 and 58 grand. Attic space improvements would be between 9 and 12 grand. Window replacement, 44 grand. Buying an emergency operations center generator. Two options there. If you were to go ahead and buy a solar generator to be used as the primary power source at all times, that would be between $32,000 and $35,000. If you were to buy an emergency use only gas operated generator, that would be between 12 and 15 grand. Another project on the list here is outdoor pavilion at the garage lot. So the forest committee is requesting funding for half of the total project cost. So that would be about $12,000 that they're requesting. Two large TVs for the owls. So the idea is that you would have a much bigger screen than we have here, and you would have a TV, one for the town office and then one for the town hall. And then an additional owl to support remote meetings for folks. Crosswalk between the town offices and the church playground. A crosswalk between the library and the village store. Sidewalk from town offices to the village store. outdoor recreational facilities, and this is a broad one, and I'm hoping we can drill down on this a little bit this evening. So trails, parks, river access, green spaces, recreational facilities, etc. High quality affordable childcare, measures to support housing, bike and pedestrian safety, broadband, support for local nonprofits, support for after-school programs, library services for families, EV charging stations, wastewater improvements in the two villages, to encourage new small businesses to come in, assistance for small businesses to compensate for the revenue loss that they suffered as a result of the pandemic, community health services, after-school programs and daycare opportunities, town library services and programs for assist families, and funding for trail signs. So as you can tell, the sort of second half of that list is a little bit broader. I don't have any cost estimates for those. And a lot of those are very sort of general statements. So it would be helpful if anybody has any more specific details around what exactly we needed. For example, high quality childcare. What are you envisioning? What kind of a project could we do with this money? Outdoor recreational facilities. What's the community conversation around that? What specifically would you want to spend the money on? So let's sort of open the floor to, more information about the list that I've already given to you, and then also any new projects that you haven't heard mentioned yet that you'd like to make sure are on the list.
Yeah, I have a question, actually, from the board members about the hiring of the grant manager. Should this even be on me? I mean, it's my understanding it's already underway and it's maybe taken care of.
Right, we already hired a grant manager.
Right.
Who is it?
And just because we felt it had to, the sooner we did that, the better, because we're at the stage where we need to be exploring grants and tracking them and accounting and having the grants manager work with the treasurer and the select board. I think what we heard though is we can use the ARPA dollars to pay for it. So I think that was our understanding anyway. So it wasn't going to be something that we had to take to the townspeople and say, you have to raise taxes for this.
I have a question about the funds. Are we talking about the whole $300 and some $1,000, even though $100 and some thousand was allocated a year ago?
So my understanding is that select board has not made any decisions on how any of the money is going to be spent yet, and so the entirety of the award, 100% of the award, is up for discussion at this point. More thoughts about
I have
this
a
specific
question,
one?
of items within the list and its various prices. What is the capacity within our existing budget or budget year to purchase some of those smaller items or items? Like I know we, for the last couple of years, have had a surplus in the highway fund, did that buy radio? Just thinking for the select board.
Repeat the question.
So if we've had surplus funds, both in the town regular budget and the highway budget for the last couple of years, could we allocate some of the funds that we approved that were approved in May in this current budget year to purchase things like the radios? That's in the grand scheme of things, not a tremendous outlay. And some would argue the cost of doing business, being able to communicate with each other. So yeah, I think about smaller items on this list. Things like computer systems are not long lasting. They're the cost of doing business.
I think we could do that. I mean, I think the timeline and the process would be if there was surplus, then say highway dollar surplus, we would budget for radios in next fiscal year's budget, and then use the highway surplus to help pay for that. If it was general fund, like say computer network upgrade for our town offices. I think in that case, we have, because it's general, on the general fund side, we have to ask for the voters' approval.
But when we approve a budget at a town meeting, we're not approving X number of dollars in a specific line. We're not approving $6,000 for electricity or whatever that number may be. We're approving a total sum of money that the select board determines how to allocate, correct?
Well, they're line items that we more or less go by.
Right, but you have flexibility
If
within
we
those
have
lines.
a surplus, the general fund, then the town can vote where to spend it. We sometimes have come up with ideas, but the town has to vote on it. Whereas the highway fund, they don't.
I don't think, I'm not really making my perspective clear. I don't believe, maybe I'm wrong, that the select board is truly, you're tied to the amount of money that the town gives you to spend. But you're not tied to this amount exactly has to go to wages, and this amount exactly has to go to gasoline, and this amount exactly has to go to electricity, and this amount, right? You have a fluid nature within your budget to transfer or allocate funds throughout the year. No,
To a certain extent, if diesel fuel doubled. And we ran over our diesel fuel budget. We could pull money out of culverts. To pay for diesel fuel. Is that what you're trying to?
yes, it's a general idea, like, if we have extra money in highway, we could allocate it towards radios. Even not being extra within that current budget year.
There's going to be a need for ARPA funds.
I don't think that some of these things require ARPA funds because I know we have capacity within our current town budgets.
Yes.
And I know it didn't end up being one of our top three, but I think it's putting it to the point and we, since over here. Once we have this list, then we have an opportunity to go see what other grants are available. So there could be grants out there for communications focused. And so we could look at getting a radio to a communications focused grant. We could probably look at getting some of the other, there's people there that you just read, 6,000, 15,000. For the grant opportunities. Now that we have this list, we could really know and target and try to find a grant for focusing on communication, a grant focusing on there's a lot of research on one thing I do want to add to, so in the last legislative session, the state legislature recognized that the firewall that they established between highway and general fund was making more headaches than it was worth for the county. So they basically removed that firewall. So if you were, for example, to create a surplus in your ARPA fund or something else within your general fund, you could use that on highway budget. Or if you have to in your highway, you could use that for other things, which is giving towns a lot more flexibility. Yep.
Thinking about the larger project with wastewater or whatever it takes to get water down, put air down to the fire department, setting aside a small amount of money to support feasibility planning, so we could actually understand what those larger projects would cost, knowing that there is really good money at the state level to support wastewater and water planning, but there will need to be probably a modest match.
Are there particular projects that folks think we need a feasibility study for this particular kind of a project we want to take on?
Well, I think the idea of water or wastewater projects to support the fairgrounds, makes a lot of sense. It could probably serve the village as well.
Great, got that down. Other projects, yeah.
I think that, the question, don't a lot of these, grants and the money allocated to certain things have to have a feasibility study, scoping study to start with. Before you even, you know, begin, I mean, you want to have a certain project, but you have to have somebody come out and see if it's feasible to do this and how much money it would cost. And those studies are, you know, you have to have matching funds, as the gentleman pointed out, for like the sidewalk thing. But my understanding was a lot of these other things needed, like you do anything with V-Trans, there's gotta be a scoping study that precedes whatever you do.
Right, exactly, yeah, so typically, anytime you're interfacing with a state agency, there's probably gonna be some sort of feasibility evaluation that happens before you can do it.
Right, so for like wastewater.
Right,
you know,
exactly.
Things like that, there would have to be a scoping study for.
Exactly, same thing, yeah.
But sticking with V-Trans for a moment. So one of the biggest numbers that we do, and I don't know if there's a feasibility study to come up with that $140,000 to pave the road out to the town of Rock. But certainly, Mary Ann, now that you're in action with getting into regular grants, I would think that would be a priority to find out whether V-Trans would be open to doing a matching grant. If it did, then that 140 turns into possibly 70. Opening up funds for some of the smaller projects. And since I have the floor, I can speak to the solar proposal, which would be at the town offices. I think the figure that was quoted was 32 to 34. The key thing as far as working with emergency backup, and the town offices has been designated as kind of a command center for emergency backup and a serious disruption of power. I mean, it would really have to be a pretty major hurricane or something that would knock out power for the whole town for 3 to 5, 7 days. So batteries will be included with that. That certainly made the price go up. The comparison with the propane, and I know the subject that you know, cost paybacks for some of these projects are. I don't have a definitive cost payback for the solar project. I can say this though, that it does provide, as long as there's a sunny day, power to the town offices every sunny day that we have. And thinking about expenses to the town, lowering the electricity bill on an annual basis pretty significantly. Not sure what's going to happen with the Belknap solar project. I get the sense that either supply chain issues or other things that may be held up. It's certainly not breaking ground this year. It'll be a great asset if it comes here. The cost payback is also kind of difficult to ascertain between a fossil fuel emergency backup, which the propane would be. If indeed no major emergency happened for 10 years, then there is no payback happening for that system. It's just sitting there. And once again, there are I don't know how many votes came in for climate change and resiliency there, but certainly the town investing in further fossil fuel infrastructure, I'm not sure really resonates that widely in the town.
Thank you. I do want to add too, so y'all may have heard some news coverage around the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. That money is still making its way down the federal pipeline. The state is going to be getting some money that they will then be allocating various existing grant programs. There'll also be some direct federal grant programs to that bill as well. I will say, because it's sparked my memory as I was reading through the list, EV charging stations are a significant focus of the Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act. So there might be some funding through the state for that kind of work. Another significant focus of that federal bill is bike and pedestrian safety, so safe streets for all. So again, there might be some funding coming through those channels for those kinds of projects. And unfortunately, federal timelines are a mystery to all of us, that we don't know when they're coming.
In scrolling through the list, I'm looking at the section that says from the planning commission regarding crosswalks and a sidewalk in town. And I would like to add an item to that of solar powered speed limit signs. Speeding has become a real problem in the village. I don't know how it is in North Conference, but here it's pretty bad. So we're going to encourage walking. I like it.
What do you do with your speeders?
Thank you, so that is excellent. Other thoughts?
I don't know if other towns did it as a criteria, but I can see both accessibility and transparency being part of how we decide. So something like digitizing our records, for example. Certainly, all of us are affected as far as potentially accessibility goes, transparency as far as the closer residents can get to seeing what goes on in municipal coverage, the better in some ways. So, I think like was said, it doesn't necessarily have to be ARPA dollars maybe spent for that, but I think it certainly meets a lot of the criteria as far as the most people long lasting because it's culturally and legally our history. So that seems a good example of something that meets a lot of those criteria.
Thank you, that's helpful, yeah, really sort of understand how those criteria come into play for individual parts. Does anybody have any more specific thoughts they could share around some of these broader categories, like community health services? Does anybody have any project ideas around community health services or support for local nonprofits? Broadband networks, are there specific gaps that should be addressed? Measures to support are there others that take on that's a big issue right now.
I think the broadband is pretty well taken care of in this town. I know that there's people that need a lot of line laid like old roads and distant houses. And we're working. I don't think that's an appropriate area.
I have a specific question I'd like more information about. I see prepared conversations about wastewater improvements. What are some of, I live, for those of you who don't know, on 110. My leach field is on top of the hill in my pig's pasture. We did that 15 or so years ago when we first moved into our house. What are some of the challenges that village residents are facing with wastewater that a town system, which $400,000 with no near cover, could address from those that put that on that list? And do we as a town, if we were to locate that system that could service our villages?
As a village resident, I'm on a septic system and have no issues. Yeah, and that's gonna be an ongoing cost because we develop that and more cost for me.
I think maybe that suggestion was more about encouraging businesses to come into the village. Right now, there's not really septic or water to support any business in town.
And at least, and my thinking was, thinking of the fairground too, if there's a way to support the work, to service the fairground and then provide a little capacity for the town to be able to have one or two businesses come in and then contribute to the tax roll. There would be an ongoing cost, but hopefully some increased revenue to help support that. I'm just thinking, the town, and the fair is so much a part of our identity, if anything ever happens. And, or if anything ever happened for the wastewater, I have no idea what the wastewater looks like down there, but.
In my house, the water's 2 feet down.
That's why it's on the hill.
So, and I think in a feasibility study, that's why that would be so important to really understand what that would look like and what it would cost, and maybe the feasibility study tells us that it's just not possible, because you're right, $400,000. A drop in the bucket for wastewater, but considering wastewater is a priority at the state level and the village doesn't have any existing systems, it feels like Tunbridge would be a good fit for someone. Those much larger grants, and there's a lot of money out there to support wastewater improvements, and there would need to be a contribution from the municipal level in town. But a lot of that, I think, we can do that from other sources, but the feasibility study is kind of that first step to understand.
That's a really good point. And the state has prioritized communities that don't have existing systems. So certainly you'd be a little bit further up in the pecking order when it comes to the state grant. Specific projects. Stuff that's not on the list yet, it should be on the list.
Well, I don't have the list that I can read, but what was the recreation part? Could you read that?
Yeah, so recreation is pretty broad, and I'd love to get some more specific details around that. So what it says is outdoor recreation facilities, such as trails, parks, river access, reading spaces, recreational. And we have more specific thoughts around that. Yeah.
I would propose to pull trails out of that and we have some existing trails that could use some maintenance and upgrade to be more accessible.
Which ones in particular are you thinking of?
All of the legal trails. And that is a public space, so it would benefit a large portion of the town, including young people that don't drive, go off the road onto these trails, and also handicap accessible.
Yeah.
So Sarah, one of the things, a lot of people here know that we put the pavilion on there from the forest committee group, and that came out of the classes that were being done from the schools up there. I think the last one, Rudy, was it like 40 something kids we had, rain or shine. That was Amy Bogart's rule. They had to come properly dressed because they were there for the day. So we decided to build an open air pavilion that would be available for the whole town. And anybody who's going to the dump will see the logs that we've got put aside. So that was also being fulfilled for outdoor classrooms, for trails. The trails come right off of that. That's the trail in the town woods, not the other limits. And I thought the logging operation was on the town forest was supposed to pay for the pavilion. We've asked for half of that to be covered because as you know, most of it, we're going through the harvest on the Drew lot. And we've got it mostly done. It's gonna go back in this winter and finish it up. But yeah, the Drew lot in particular, you won't see another harvest in there for at least 15, maybe 20 years. So the amount of money that we harvested out of that money is gonna fulfill every need we have, whether it's culvert repair, floods, flood damage, the trails for the next 15, 20 years. So we've approached the ARPA funds for half of that pavilion to be covered by that. And that total cost that we have, it covers Matt Loftus up there preparing the site, and then the building of it, Shane Young, so all local people. That's a small portion of town that would consider. Hopefully, a lot of people will go up. Hopefully. Open to the public.
project ideas.
Yeah.
Liz, to your point, I was just thinking, if we all thought about this a moment, what are we enjoying today that was done 100 years ago?
Well, I think of something like the library, which is private, not all towns. Like that was privately founded, there's private funds that fund it. And so, for a town our size, we have an exceptional library, and that is generations of people thinking about what the kids are gonna need in the future, so that's a great example. Well, and obviously all the funds, people just giving cash to the town that pay benefits for generations, but those are when you think like, people's past generosity or anticipating, knowing, we need a public library, even if it's not all, when we were forming it, not all towns made that a priority.
Along those lines, a nonprofit called the Tunbridge Society bought, a chunk of what's now the Brew Lot for water protection mainly, but now it's also recreation, and I think looking at parcels of land that are within town for public recreation would be one of those things that would be good to people.
I think we're sitting in a beautiful gift right now.
Yeah.
It's been a long time since I've been here in the town, maybe soon. But it's such an incredible building. And yes, it may not be big enough for our town meeting any longer, but it's still a tremendous asset. Whether it be for a meeting like this, or a music performance, or bone builders, or whatever those things are that use that space. They don't build public buildings like this.
And we did an energy audit on this building. And we found out that it's probably pretty good for COVID because it changes its clean air every 23 minutes. Little breezy in here.
Just thinking about resiliency and we're talking about people 100 years ago and what people may be thinking 100 years from now. Even though we have until 2026 to, kind of, all right, you got the money, you got the bids, everything, good to go ahead. That's a long time from now. There is a climate emergency globally. And so some of these projects that deal with infrastructure, some of those numbers for the tightening up were pretty high there. I don't know if we're going to get to a point of getting competitive bids on the weatherization of the town hall. But it's a select board when it starts to make decisions, particularly on things that have significant payback over time. If you wait 4 years to implement those projects, you've lost that amount of time for payback. So I would just urge that some of these things that are more sensitive, also the cost of doing things, like getting that bid 2 years from now, rather than the bid that's on the table by the end of 22, early 23, that's a locked in bid. I think inflation is going to be with us, and the prices are only going up to keep an eye on the dollars.
Amy, we should bring up the brick grant.
Yeah, well, I was looking on the town website for the ARPA list, and the planning commission with the blessing of the select board is applying for a grant. The acronym is BRIC, but it's building resilient infrastructure in communities. And we're applying for this grant from FEMA, and it's for hazard mitigation in the town in flood resiliency. So there's probably something in the neighborhood of a 75-25 match. So this would be a case where we would be able to use ARPA funds for the match. And we're looking at culverts in areas down by the Kingery where the bank is kind of collapsing, things like that. So the grant would be for, a scoping project, to bring in an engineer, someone who could look at all these areas that we identify, and Rodney's thrown in a few ideas of his own, to get a sense of what is urgent and get a timeline and what we should do. So it's kind of like in tandem with ARPA and maybe using some of the ARPA funds. Not clear on how much the grant.
Yeah, we're not clear on
Really
how
know
much the whole
anything.
thing would cost us, so we can't tell you what the math is.
But you have the timeline.
We need to, the planning commission is working on it, and I think our new grants manager should be looped in with us.
Well, the timing, I did a little webinar about this last week, and the timing, would work with the ARPA timeline. So we could use potentially ARPA funds for a match for the grant. And it would be sort of at the same time, 2024 and 2026, for the allocation of funds. And the match is, we get 75% awarded, and we have to, 25% could also be in kind, so we could actually like use the road crew for some of that work. I don't think we meet the criteria for a town in need, where then the match would be 10% to the 90% funding. Because you have to be under, a town of under 3,000, which we are, but I think we're not at that economic level where we, that's one whole, right? We don't need that, so.
And just keep everybody in the loop, the other one that Rod brought up on this was the spring road. He said that there's a portion of the spring road that's ready to collapse into the brook anytime. He said it was gonna be a lot of money.
Yeah, great, Chapman's.
Yeah, around the corner there, I guess. I know he's been bringing it up a few times, and he said it's gonna be really pricey. So if we can get any of these grants, the flood resiliency grants, there's also some grants out there for, Rudy would have to help with this, we'll talk about it on the planning commission, that would be available for buying up anybody that's the floodplain, and they end up purchasing the land at fair market, and then that gets destroyed and trees planted or whatever. But also for the first time, I had never heard of this before, Rudy, where they'll purchase land that does not have buildings on it, that's in the floodplain. That we think is something we should purchase, so it couldn't be sold or built up. They obviously don't want that building or that structure to end up taking the bridge out.
But I think all these hazard mitigation ideas, they only bump into ARPA, and that maybe we would tap into ARPA for a match, but there are grants for these things.
Just to keep you in the loop.
Thank you. It's really helpful to share that information. We'll come up at 8:30. We've had a long day. Do folks want to continue talking, or should we close this chapter? Okay. I'm happy to continue going if folks have more ideas.
Well, I'd like to discuss what would be next.
And I'll pass that over to the select board. Want to just walk us through what next?
I think your help there, we could start filling in this rubric and narrowing it down. Keep people posted on where we're at, and then come back for another meeting at some point, and maybe more details, maybe more budget numbers, that sort of thing. Go from there.
Is there a time when we're gonna have a list locked down? I know the timeline of ARPA funding, but is there a goal is to have a plan set timeline?
And I mean, this is something that I guess we should talk about too with you, Sarah, is that say, 3 out of 6 ideas we're really sure on, and we work them into our budgeting for next town meeting, but half of them we're not totally sure on. Is it okay to do it incrementally like that, or to, commit half the money and then say, well, we still have a year and a half to figure out where the other half is going.
Absolutely, you don't have to do it all at once, also, you can do it incrementally, and again, if you do that switch, like the conversion of all of the federal character, the local character, timelines on the table, you've got all the time as well.
Can you rescind?
Within, in what way?
A commitment's made early and for some reason, it didn't pan out or won't.
Yeah.
Is it possible to rescind before the deadline to commit?
Yeah, yeah. You just need to make sure that the ledger reflects everything accurately.
Thinking of between now and potentially firming up the list for the next meeting, getting back to that point about broadening the number of voices that get to weigh in on the list. Is there any work that can be done between now and then to help support that effort to get more people involved in the discussion?
You know, you don't put that in like where the community as a whole, I think. You know, it depends on what works best in your community, what's been good ways to reach folks who aren't able to come out on, you know, Wednesday evening and come to a meeting. Maybe that's a website, or maybe it's a survey, you know, an online survey where people can quickly respond and give their feedback. Maybe it's a table at a festival, if you've got a fall festival coming up or something like that, you can be out there and start running some community opinions. There's all different ways to reach people. It just really depends on what works best for y'all, and what's worked for your community in the past.
I would like to propose that the select board has what they're doing, that maybe a committee gets formed to help in this process of distillation of ideas, projects, that kind of thing. And also, you mentioned the survey that, there were 35 people or so in this room. And then, it would be nice to open it up to a greater number through an online survey. Other towns have done that. I know you've had a conversation, Sarah, about that. Where it basically gets, I have a couple of examples of it actually. It gets put out to the community. How to, what are your ideas? How much is it going to cost? It's actually quite a bit of detail required of somebody submitting an idea. But I just think, to leave it to the select board, it's all over the map in terms of how communities are dealing with this, but it seems like a lot of work on their part, and there may be a way to alleviate that burden on them.
I know in terms of examples of the surveys from other communities, I think there's a couple ways to go about that. What I've seen sort of systems where you ask community members to put forward project ideas, and they would, for example, give you a budget estimate and maybe a scope what they're thinking about, partners who are already working on it. And then there's also the option of just getting like a temperature check from your community on, priority areas that you want to focus on. We have this list of projects and they fall into these categories where your priority categories, or you've got checking the criteria again. So you can sort of get a feedback kind of survey, or you can get sort of like a formal proposal kind of collection. Oh, yeah.
I think it should be left in the hands of the select board. I think because you have to work closely with the town treasurer in the budgets to juggle this money. And they're more familiar probably with all the different aspects of things that have been hovering over the town for a while. It might be an appropriate place. Sorry, guys. But I think with input from all of us and how we feel, and this is great, that they can manage it. And I think that's what it should be. I think it's going to be quite a bit of work for Becky, working with them. And remember, we could get audited on this, we could do it properly.
The simple thing to make it less work for Becky, what I heard at the very beginning, is to allocate the grant funding for an existing town expense, pay salaries, wages, whatever, and then use that money that is freed up, put it into surplus fund or wherever you want to hold it, to spend it without filling out federal paperwork. That's
So if you were to take that approach, basically the town would be reporting to treasury, you would say, okay, we spent our money on salaries and benefits for this particular town. And it would be a very simple reporting process back to treasury. If you were to go ahead and spend your project, your ARPA dollars directly on project and say, okay, we're not gonna pay for salaries and benefits, we're just gonna use your dollars and pay for a bridge that you want to do. That's not too much more reporting. You have to track things carefully. You have to, say exactly how much money is going to what and all of that. But I think the main benefit that you get out of the first approach where you're paying salaries and benefits is that you don't have to worry about procurement regulations and the timeline gets taken away, right? So you've got that flexibility to use dollars with minimal administrative sort of headache around making sure you're using them on time and, am I going out to a formal bid process for all of this, that gets taken away.
But for what in this is suggested to work, we have to be able to have a rainy day fund or some sort of fund in which we can store the money, right? And is that a question?
Well, that was like, it said you can't establish rainy day funds with it, right?
Well, but I think if the money is fungible, because I think if we pay for administrative fees, we can then do whatever we want. I mean, it's sort of silly, but we can do whatever we want. But if we're restricted by state law from establishing a fund,
Yeah.
in which you can store, then
don't.
we have to hold ourselves to account and say, we'll remember that we saved $400,000 and we'll keep
So-
track of that.
So when can be established at the next town meeting? We can simply bring it up to say, we would like to create this fund with this purpose. And we're gonna fund it with this amount of money. And then it would be fun.
And
Or
Heartland
if
just did that.
it got voted down, like say, what's our ARPA money, 300,000?
Just try.
It's like,
So essentially. And then this is hypothetical, like, this is how we go, it would become surplus, and like we do every year, we say, we have this amount of surplus, how would we like to spend? Would we like to do this with it, would we like to do this with it, would we like to do this with it? So then it could relieve tax money at that moment.
well, that was kind of my point earlier about tax relief. If people were like, we don't want any project, so they vote against all those funds, does that mean it automatically goes back to the frame tax burden?
The way I'm understanding this, not necessarily, because we would have to come up with a consensus about how we wanted to spend our surplus. Like we do every year, like, we have this much in surplus. This year it went, to a building fund for the garage, and I don't remember all of it, but it went to those places. We would do the same thing. But in this case, what I imagine we would do is there would be a thing that we want to create this fund to put this money.
I guess my concern is if it gets voted down, my understanding is that the surplus just gets refunded to the taxpayers.
So I've never done that because we've
It
never.
always passes.
Well, we have to decide how to spend it, like, yeah.
If we
just
vote
do that.
And if we voted for it this year, we would know we had the funds in advance of that 2024
Yeah.
deadline. And if it fails, then that may give us a small window to
So
press the panic button and figure out what plan
the
B
thing
is
though is,
like.
we can't walk away until we decide what we're gonna do with it. You can't just say, oh, we don't know what we're doing this money, it's just gonna sit here. We have to figure it out at that moment. Whether we create a fund and it sits for the next 4 years, that's fine. But we have to decide what we're gonna do with it at that time. If it's surplus. We have to create that purpose.
So that essentially creates a deadline to use those funds if it's in the surplus, or does that, putting it in surplus eliminate that?
It wouldn't create a deadline for you necessarily unless you, decided as a town that you needed to spend it by a certain amount of time. Your surplus funds that you generate have no timeline on them. So the idea is you would put them into a fund, that's then a reserve fund, right? And we would use it for the project as we figure them out. So Portland just did this, right? It's like we're just established a fund for storing the surplus funds that are being created because they are basically doing quarterly payments for all of their staff benefits and salaries. And then every time they move that money over, they're just putting it over into the surplus fund, they're throwing it away, and that's what's gonna get used for the projects that they're eventually gonna take on.
I think it would be important to have a deadline to commit to some projects instead of just pushing it on down year to year without getting any of our projects accomplished.
There are. If we put it in a rainy day fund, does that count in the eyes of the treasury as expended?
So you would have expended your money because you used it to pay salaries and benefits, that's the moment of expenditure. You created a surplus, yeah, and the treasurer doesn't care what happens with that surplus, that is, does that help? That's the question. You want to go to the-
I think so, yeah. Derek, do you have anything to say? Very much.
No. No, just the beginning. Still the beginning of the process. And the part of being done, one hand, we're gonna spend money. Before you don't want to spend. So, do you think there'll be more meetings?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't know when.
And I think, Sarah, you're involved for a while. Now, Marianne is involved for a while.
So maybe we can get an idea of some of the grants, pin down some of these grants.
Yeah.
I want to clarify, so if somebody has a thought after this meeting, and they're like, oh, I have a project idea, who should they email? With that project idea?
Me.
I have like 3 emails, so just pick one of them off the website and send it to me.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Yeah, nice to meet